Oh, all right, Anya. Hi, haven't seen a couple of you guys in a while. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So for those of you that were not in attendance this morning, I see new people joining here now from this morning. This is our second session of our day. And this afternoon, or excuse me, second session of the morning, new housing law and sustainable communities, what's working and what's not. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording these sessions, and if you would like to get access to the recordings and or any of the presentations that are being made, we have a link to our web page that has all this registrant info. It's pcl.org registrant info. I'll have Johnny, our event coordinator here, post that link in the chat box for you. And I just want to take a moment here to thank Johnny. Virtual clap and applause for Johnny. He puts all of these assemblies and events together, and it's a lot of the behind the scenes work. So thanks, Johnny, for doing that. And he'll post that in the chat box for everyone. You will also be getting a feedback form emailed to you at the end of the session to any of the registrants here. So look forward to that. Those feedback forms are really important to us. Please let us know what worked, what didn't work, what we can do better. It really helps us guide these events and assemblies and virtual symposia that we do throughout the year. If you have any questions, please contact us at events@pcl.org. Or if you'd like to support PCL's assembly and or our general work, please consider donating at pcl.org/donate. So I want to give a big thank you to all our sponsors. We couldn't do this without them. And we want to especially thank our gold and silver sponsors, Chatton Brown, Carstens and Minter LLP, National Wildlife Federation, Sage Sweetword, and Shoot Mahali Weinberger LLP. So with that out of the way, I see some new faces here. That's great. Let's jump into our first session, aligning state, whoops, sorry, that was our first session this morning. New housing law and sustainable communities, what's working and what's not. And I want to introduce and thank our moderator for today's panel, Matt Baker, our PCL policy director. So please.
Thanks, Howard. And thank you everybody for joining today. I hope that you were able to join the first panel too. There's an overview, legal overview of a number of laws that could be a part of this discussion today. The purpose of this panel is really to sort of take a step back and look at the big picture of like how effective have we been with the amount of policy that's been focused on addressing the housing crisis and the affordability crisis in California. How are we doing on the ground? Are we, there's been funding programs and legislation and regulatory policy around general plans and the regional housing allocations, streamlining mechanisms that streamline environmental review and permitting processes. Taking all of this together, are we starting to meet our goals? Are we starting to see progress? There's a subset of those laws too that also think about housing in relation to meeting our climate goals and our equity goals, putting our housing in the right places to reduce the amount of driving that we have and to improve health outcomes and improve equitable access to jobs and services and opportunity. How are we doing in those areas? I have really happy to have a great panel of experts with a wide range of experience in these issues. I have Marina Wyatt, Vice President of Government Affairs for the California Housing Consortium, Dov Kidin, the Senior Planner for Sacramento Area Council of Governments, among other duties, is responsible for coordinating the regional housing needs allocation for CEQA with the regional transportation plan. Veronica Beatty, Director of Policy and Research for the California Coalition of Rural Housing, and Anya Lawyer, partner with public interest advocates and longtime and respected housing and housing justice advocate in the Capitol. So thank you all for being here today. I just want to dive right in by way of like offering opportunity for you to give opening comments, I'll just give you the general question of, what do you think is working and what not? Specific examples or a general overview. Marina, I'll start. I'll kick that to you first.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me. And for those watching and don't know a lot about the California Housing Consortium, we're an affordable housing advocacy organization focused on the production and preservation of low and moderate income housing. I don't want to be super negative, but one of the things when I was talking with folks, other panelists yesterday in preparation for this, I think the state sort of has fundamentally never kind of thought about housing planning and delivery in a really kind of cohesive way. And so what we end up with today is a lot of the way our approaches end up being a little bit more piecemeal than I think. How do we really all come together and sort of thought about what was the best way to plan for housing in the right places and ensure that it's, once you plan for it, those housing developments get approved and that we're meeting the needs of sort of all Californians on all income spectrums. I think we would probably, all of us together would have come up with probably a different system than what we have with today. But given the system we have, I think the last few years we have made progress. In the affordable housing space, we're building more units. We've hit sort of our annual capacity of the number of units that we can produce every year. And that's in large thanks to a lot of the work that's happened around funding over the last few years, between sort of the state housing bond in 2018, local housing bonds that have added more funding to the system, streamlining bills that have been really helpful for affordable housing developers. Those things all combined have really helped us in today's moment do the most that we can do in the system. But I think, there's certainly a lot more we can do. And I know that's a lot of what we'll probably talk about a bit today as well.
Thanks, Marina. Dov, do you have a perspective to share on some specific things that are working or not working?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I think in terms of what's working, I think maybe the easiest example of state legislation that's actually working to deliver housing is the series of bills that have happened on ADUs. I think starting in 2016, the state sort of began overriding local ordinances to make it easier, faster, cheaper to build ADUs. ADU production statewide was pretty consistently, I think, in the hundreds, certainly less than 1,000 per year before that, and then dramatically rose to about 5,000 in 2017, 9,000 in 2018, 12,000 in 2019 and 20, and then it's all the way up to 20,000 units in 2021. And that's not an insignificant number of units. That's over 15% of California's permits that are now ADUs and made possible by state legislation with zero subsidy. And it's even more pronounced in a few sort of overperforming cities. Certainly Los Angeles has been kind of the all-star here. We're literally 1 out of every 4 permitted units, and the second largest city in the nation is an ADU, which is pretty astounding. So that's definitely been a success. I think in terms of what's not working, and this is a little bit niche, so humor me here, but I'm not convinced that the efforts to affirmatively further fair housing have made really meaningful inroads, specifically to actually open up our high opportunity single family neighborhoods to more affordable housing types. It's been really promising to see AFFH start to get built into all of our other California processes. I think AB 1771 did a really great job to incorporate it into the RENA methodology process. I think we're really proud at CEQA of how we incorporated that into our methodology. Of course, the RENA methodology is at the regional level, and we're sort of giving allocations to cities. There's a lot that happens on fair housing, within within each city at the neighborhood level. And I think the intention was AB 686 was this fantastic start, right? Which it is, to kind of start ensuring that all of our local planning actually furthers fair housing. That said, I think when it comes to to me, one of the key components of AFFH, which is to better integrate these high opportunity neighborhoods, open them up to more rental units, so they're not all ownership, more affordable housing types, basically anything that doesn't require $100,000 plus down payment as a price of admission. Yeah, I don't think there are good forcing mechanisms in place, at least for a region like the CEQA region, to actually to do that. So jurisdictions in our region, we never have a hard time reaching our moderate or our above moderate income RHNA numbers because we have plenty of room to spread out. We have a ton of single family capacity based on our sort of numbers, orders of magnitude more single family capacity than we need by 2050. So never going to have a problem hitting our above mod and mod numbers. So for us, the only RHNA forcing mechanism is for rezoning to accommodate lower income RHNA. And hypothetically, per 686, you should be rezoning for lower income in high opportunity neighborhoods. These are places with good schools, low pollution burden, great access to jobs, so on. However, in order to count a site for lower income per state rules, and this was strengthened with AB 1397, it usually needs to be over half an acre, the site, and usually needs to be able to accommodate 50 to 150 units for sort of your typical project. And that makes sense, right? Because that's what a typical tax credit affordable project looks like. But the problem is that most of the high opportunity neighborhoods in our region, at least, are already subdivided into single family homes. So these are small parcels. 90% of residential land and 97% of residential parcels in our region, at least, that are high opportunity tracts per those TCAC maps, are single family homes. And so these parcels can't really be used for lower income. And the upshot is that there really isn't any reason from a RHNA perspective why a local government would have to upzone their widest or wealthiest neighborhoods. And I understand how we got there, but I think from an AFFH perspective, this is something that we as a state really need to reckon with if we're actually serious about improving access to opportunity.
Thanks. I would hope that we can unpack some of these things that both you and Marina have brought up as we go on. But Veronica, what do you have to think about in the rural perspective?
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the California Coalition for Rural Housing, we're an advocacy organization that has a membership based of mission-driven affordable housing developers, local government staff, activists, and we work to promote affordable housing and complete communities in rural areas through advocacy, organizing, research, and increasingly technical assistance. So I think one of the things that we're seeing that's some positive direction is there is an increasing focus on thinking about how some of this housing legislation and funding programs plays out in rural areas. We're set to do a statewide study of farm worker housing need for the first time ever in this coming year. We've seen increasing rural set-asides in funding programs, additional money towards mobile home park, manufactured housing community preservation, which is really important because that's a key area of unsubsidized affordable housing in a lot of our rural communities, and also a focus on additional funding for farm worker housing. And so that additional funding and the adaptation of funding program guidelines to kind of meet the needs of rural communities is really important and really promising. That's, seen us working with PCL on some nitty gritty, like what counts as your denominator when you're thinking about infill? Can we count different kinds of infrastructure that these rural communities need as, a necessary part of the project? But overall, the state's approach still doesn't take rural community concerns as seriously as we'd like to see. I've talked about those opportunity maps. There's a real urban bias in a lot of the data gathering and data collection that we're doing as a state that's driving our funding programs. So, we appreciate the AFFH goals and that move towards having a sensible kind of big picture strategy. But a lot of that relies on census data that simply isn't very accurate in rural areas. We see areas that are, unbuildable or prime ag land get designated as high opportunity zones. And so we're kind of busy fighting those things and in a way that doesn't let us step back and think about some real AFFH goals in those rural areas just because the data is so flawed. We also see, we're working with rural governments that are understaffed. In multiple jurisdictions, I've talked to the one guy who's the planning staff for the jurisdiction, and that's half of what he does. And the other half of what he does is collect child support, right? So for that that particular guy, hundreds of new housing bills, all these additional complexities are hard to keep track of. And that's why, you know, for CCRH, it's good to keep us in business. We're doing more and more technical assistance with those local governments, but it's difficult to keep track of and kind of move us overall towards those goals. We also see a real need for additional local housing investment. A lot of our rural communities are much more reliant on these state programs. They're less likely to have run a local bond like LA has or other, you know, urban areas. And they need deep infrastructure investments as well to kind of keep pace with housing production. And of course, that's all against this backdrop of increasing wildfire risk, other natural disaster risk, and thinking about the sustainability planning in combination with resilience planning.
Yeah, thanks for a lot to unpack there. Anya, I don't know, do you have anything positive to add to that?
I've got some positives and some negatives. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here today. For those of you who don't know me, as Matt said, I am with a firm called Public Interest Advocates, and we represent a wide range of mission-driven organizations in the state capital that focus on lifting up the needs of low-income communities and communities of color, predominantly in the housing space. We also do some water work. And, you know, thanks, Dove, for shouting out any number of bills that I worked on, including 1397 and 1771 and 686, all of which we're really proud of. A couple of things I think that are working. I want to add another bill to that list that was part of the big 2017 housing package that we worked on in collaboration with Marina, actually, which is AB 72. California for years has actually had a pretty strong suite of laws on the books that were designed to ensure that communities were planning appropriately, having high density zoning in high opportunity areas. Like, we didn't really call them that at that time, but all of these things have actually been on the books for a long time in housing element law and a few other places in the planning and zoning law, but they were largely not enforced in any strong or substantive way. It was kind of a handful of statewide and local legal services organizations that were sort of bringing suits under housing element law and constantly pushing HCD to have stronger enforcement. And it was a big uphill battle. So we saw fairly weak housing elements despite a robust body of law that could have allowed us to have much stronger ones. And so AB 72 was a bill that was focused on actually enforcing the laws that we have. And that really spurred the start of the development of the enforcement regime at HCD. And, you know, shout out to the Newsom administration for really recognizing that actually enforcing laws that are on the books is a key strategy. And I think we now see through all of that, we're seeing local governments, you know, certainly we still have some bad actors out there, but a lot of local governments are really faithfully trying to comply with the law because they don't want to deal with enforcement actions. And that we're seeing much stronger housing elements in the sixth cycle. They're not perfect. There's still a lot of work to do. And I definitely agree with Dove on AFFH. Like, there's a lot, like it's a big concept. And in addition to steering more affordable housing into high resource, high opportunity communities, the other piece of that that needs a whole lot more work is it's about making sure that as we bring investment into low-income communities, we're not actually spurring displacement and really lifting up the voices and the needs of people who live in those communities to ensure that they can benefit from the investment that actually comes in. And so a lot more work to do, but a lot of good has come out of all of that too. And I think we're steering in a much better direction. I think a couple of things on the negative side. I think, frankly, in some ways, housing being like the hottest issue in the state and one of the hottest issues in the Capitol and in the press is one of the worst things that has ever happened to housing policy, because every legislator wants a housing bill. The press wants to write endless stories about housing. And so a lot of it is like, you know, we did this bill 2 years ago and like nothing has changed. We haven't solved the housing crisis. And I think those of us deeply engaged in housing policy understand that this is a crisis that is, you know, 100+ years in the making, and it's not going to be solved overnight. And we are seeing in these sixth cycle housing elements and a lot of other things that are happening, like a good long game in the works. And sometimes we see bills that either really aren't going to help that long game or actually may take us backwards because people want to see results immediately, and that's just not really a thing in this space. Another thing is, as Marina mentioned, her developers are maxing out the system. But we are kind of uniquely situated to influence affordable housing production much more so than we are market rate production. As Dove pointed out, in a lot of places, there's no issue producing those units anyway. But we can drastically scale up affordable housing production, which we desperately need by increasing resources, both at the state and the federal level. And we really haven't done that at scale, and we still make sort of odd choices about our housing investments, including, you know, the state spends something like $5 billion a year on the mortgage interest deduction, and Lord only knows how much the federal government spends on it. And most studies show that that doesn't really benefit anybody, and yet we continue to spend those dollars. Imagine what we could do with those dollars if we spent those on affordable housing, right? So we make choices all the time, and we're still not making the choices to really scale up affordable housing production to the extent that it's needed. And I think a lot more work is needed in that space, which I would imagine we all agree with.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. I mean, I guess you really touched on what I wanted to ask next. Is, you know, you highlighted some things that definitely need some more work. I mean, I agree with you. Displacement is one of them, and we're trying to bring, you know, investment in higher density info areas. But I guess, you know, with all the work that has been on the books, you know, is it a matter of more time? You know, we're certainly not meeting our housing goals yet, but do we, you know, are we making progress with more time as we better enforce the laws that are on the books? We get the new housing elements online. You know, do you think we're on track? Is it a matter of more funding and investment from the state and federal level that really takes it to that to that scale that we need it? And I'll open that up.
I mean, just I'll just touch on a part of that, you know, and the affordable, and Anya kind of touched on it too, the affordable housing development community has huge capacity, and we are, you know, every program today is oversubscribed twofold or more. And so there is a big question of the piece of the puzzle that is the funding. And if we had more funding, we could be doing, instead of 20,000 units, we could do 40,000 units if there's a workforce to also build those units. So money, you know, I think therefore, like, part of it is, yes, we are on track. We have a pipeline, we have projects ready to go, we have people ready to, and we certainly have the need in the community of people who need those units. And so, you know, money is a big linchpin.
Yeah, we definitely.
Oh, go ahead, Veronica.
I'll definitely echo Marina's comments on the funding constraints and also the workforce constraints. We see that a lot in rural communities. And I'd add that we, at CCRH, we're also advocating for specific investment in a tribal housing program. So in some cases, I think we need to come up with funding solutions that do better meet specific population needs. Tribal housing is a place where we have not invested really significantly in California. A lot of the existing funding programs have requirements that are difficult for tribes to meet, especially given the sort of sovereign government to sovereign government relationship that's quite unique. And I'd also like to add that as we think about, you know, meeting our housing need, understandably, there's a lot of focus on production and creating new housing, but it's also really important for us to think about preserving the affordable housing we have, especially as covenants expire, you know, buildings are set to go market rate, and places where we've made public investment, that investment could be lost if we're not also thinking about preservation.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, Veronica. I mean, on the funding question, the governor's January draft budget was just released last week. You know, we've seen some cuts from commitments that were made to housing in the previous budget cycle. I think that there's some relief that there weren't stronger cuts with the expected deficit this year. But you know, the question is, you know, is the state, you know, really investing to the scale that we needed to meet the needs that we have for affordable housing?
I
No.
mean, I can't kick that off. No, we're definitely not. And it's going to be a tough budget year. I mean, the governor's budget predicted, I think it was a $22.5 billion budget. The LAO is saying you should be projecting an additional, I think, $14 billion on top of that in deficit. So it may not be the year that we're able to really go deep. But also historically, the general fund has not been the main source of funding for affordable housing. It was redevelopment back in the day. It's bonds, it's a whole host of other things. And so they're like separate from the challenges with the general fund, there are other ways that we can find resources for affordable housing. But yeah, we desperately need to scale up funding. And it really is, I think, the single biggest thing we can do to actually increase housing stock in the places where we have the biggest gaps, right? For low, very low, and particularly extreme low income households, and also make sure we have the resources on the preservation side, right? To keep units that are losing their deed restrictions actually affordable. So yeah, and then also I just want to, because, you know, my work involves also a lot of anti-displacement and tenant protection work. We also have a lot more work to do to sort of just recognize the deep instability that low-income tenants have in this state in their housing. Like a lot of people are very, very tenuously housed. And so it's no surprise that we're continuing to see in much of the state increasing homelessness. Because we're, you know, we both don't have the resources to get people off the streets, and we're not really stopping their flow into the streets. And so a lot more work to come in that space. And we have done some good policy making, both around direct tenant protections and sort of indirect protections from displacement. But there's more we can build on there, so that we don't sort of deepen the crisis as we're trying to dig out of it.
And I just want to add, we certainly appreciate the budget dollars that were allocated to housing production over the past couple of years, but truly, like, we really should have, it would have been great if we had taken more advantage of the boom cycles that we had to sort of set aside money for the downturn years for housing. Counter-cyclical investment in affordable housing is sort of critical to closing that supply gap. These are the years when the market rate sort of development community slows a lot because of the higher interest rates and other market conditions. And that's really the time that affordable housing development can take advantage of the construction workforce being perhaps more available, land being more available. We're not subject to the same market conditions that market rate developers have to work within. And so this is not the time. We've seen over the years, we particularly saw between like 2010 and 2017, the opportunity cost of not continuing investment in affordable housing during those downturn years. And so, we really hope to see in today's world that we learn from those mistakes, and we recognize the importance that even when we have to make when the legislature and the governor have to make very tough budget decisions, that kind of doubling down on these investments during this period is sort of the thing that they should be focusing on to ensure that more families don't fall into homelessness, and that we can build more units for those that are struggling the most.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll join the chorus. And obviously, I think we need more affordable housing dollars in the state. The need is massive. So, certainly in lockstep there. I think what I'd also just add that, we also need more money for housing related infrastructure in the state to really catalyze infill development in the places that we really need substantial redevelopment to meet our climate targets. We've found in the CEQA region, at least, and I think it's probably universal in the state, that there's often, aging sewer, water, other sort of non-sexy infrastructure issues in a lot of these suburban corridors that we're really counting on to revitalize for climate purposes. We have a program at CEQA called Green Means Go that is sort of oriented around these infrastructure investments. We secured about $34 million for grants supporting those non-transportation infrastructure investments in what we call our green zones, sort of our, very low VMT areas, right? And the intention there is to stimulate that infill, but frankly, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the need. So I'm hoping that the state continues to look to invest dollars in those types of things.
Well, Doug, since you brought that up, I'll go to that and the position that the MPOs are in developing the regional plan. So in 2008, many people on this webinar would know SB 375 was passed, which mandated development of a land use scenario in coordination with the regional transportation plans in an effort to reduce vehicle miles traveled and distances between housing, jobs, and services, in an effort to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and meet our regional greenhouse gas reduction targets in the transportation sector. And also, with many co-benefits going along with that, preserving natural and working lands, improving public health outcomes, and providing more equitable access to jobs and services and opportunity. From your perspective, and working on the RENA with CEQA's regional plan, Dev, the question is not just, are we producing enough units? Are we getting them the investments in the right places? Are we aligning our transportation and infrastructure investments with our housing investment in a way that is meeting those multifaceted goals that we have?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've been at this problem for 15 years now in a meaningful way in our region. We underwent a sort of ground up process called the Blueprint that kind of was one of the driving factors why 375 was written. And I think there's been some progress for sure. I think what kind of stimulated the Blueprint in the first place was kind of the really explosive sprawl growth that we saw in the 2003 to 2006 range. So we're certainly not seeing that, but I don't think anyone has sort of said that we're truly implementing the type of growth that we need to see as part of these regional plans. I think in our region we talk about having to do work across 3 different lenses. So there's a production gap, a product type gap, a spatial efficiency gap. We need to almost double production. Of course, you mentioned that. We need that production to really shift away from large lot single family products to more attached products, apartments, things like that. And then we need those homes to happen in our infill areas. And, so you could say that another way, we need to really somewhat dramatically increase multifamily housing production in our low VMT areas. Historically, we get about 15% of growth in what we call our centers and corridors. Think of those as sort of our very low VMT areas. We need that over 33%. We've been about 19% last 10 years. I think 19% of our units are attached units. We need that over 50%. We're still seeing quite a bit of greenfield growth. It's only accelerated during COVID as folks kind of seek larger homes, a little bit more room. And then we have another huge challenge in our region, which is that we have tens of thousands of entitled units in greenfield plans that have vested development rights that are just kind of waiting to come online when the market turns. So, we have huge challenges when it comes to sustainable compact development patterns in our region. I think in terms of state legislation, it's definitely improved the likelihood of implementing our SES and the other regional plans across the state. I think, recent changes, getting back to your earlier point, Matt, around time, I mean, the recent changes to the RENA process are still kind of trickling through, right? It feels like years ago that we did the RENA methodology, but, housing elements were kind of just adopted. Folks that are having to do rezones are still doing them. So I think it remains to be seen how that all plays out, but I think it probably helps. I think all the stuff, with the streamlining has certainly helped. I know many projects, and in fact, a recent one up in Rockland, hundreds of units near Sierra College wouldn't have happened without SB 330, Housing Accountability Act, things like that. So, to be perfectly honest, I think there's a lot more things that need to actually turn the ship, at least in our region. I think the state needs to continue to make it easier, faster, cheaper to build infill multifamily. And I think, that means more regulatory changes. It also means that shift in funding for infrastructure that I mentioned, and transportation investments that actually support and catalyze that infill.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree. I mean, I think there's progress, but the fact remains that the California Air Resources Board is, documented in their progress reporting on SB 375 that VMT, vehicle miles traveled per capita, is going up all across the state, not going down. We're not meeting the climate piece of the goal of 375. I agree that maybe with more time, but I think we're headed in the right direction. But the question is, are we really doing it fast enough from a climate perspective? And I want to circle back to what, Anya bringing up displacement. I mean, this is a really critical question when it comes to meeting our climate environmental goals. If we are successfully, targeting densification and a lot of our investment to infill rather than greenfield growth, we have to, and particularly directing investment towards disadvantaged or historically underserved communities to right past wrongs, which we absolutely need to. We have to recognize that that amount of investment could bring gentrification displacement pressures on the most vulnerable in those communities, that we always have to keep that in mind with both our housing and infrastructure investments. We have to be able to mitigate that gentrification displacement risk to ensure that those existing residents benefit from those investments. And I mean, I would like to maybe, Anya, if you have thoughts about, more specifically about work that could be done in that area, I'd like to hear it.
Sure, I can talk about that. And I actually just wanted to piggyback also on something that Dove said. There was a bill a few years back by Assemblymember Wicks that was attempting to get at the oversupply of single family zone land through housing element law by restricting the amount of RENA, your above moderate and moderate income RENA, that you could allocate to single family sites. And I thought there was huge potential in that bill, but unfortunately, I think if that bill ran now, it could probably be a much higher percentage than what they were able to win in that bill. And I don't remember the number. It was maybe like 20% or something like that. If we had gotten ahead of the 6 cycle housing elements with a much bigger number, I think that would have been a game changer. And that's unfortunate because it's a real problem, right? There is still a lot of single family zoned land. And we got to grapple with that because it is making it really hard to fulfill the promise of 375, a bill which I unfortunately have been around long enough that I actually worked on way back in the day. But on the displacement side, yeah, we have a lot more work to do there. We have a lot of lessons we've learned from, some of the policies we had baked into redevelopment law, which was a mixed bag about sort of how you actually protect people and ensure that they can stay in their communities. Acknowledging that we also probably need to bring in, more market rate housing into those communities. But, the law right now is a evolving patchwork. It's one new evolution, for example, is that on housing element sites now, if you're going to come in and you're going to build something on a housing element site and you're taking out existing housing, you got to have a plan to replace all of it. You can't approve the project if you don't do that. You have to replace any units that are affordable to or occupied by lower income households, and you have to plan for that. So that's a good evolution. Some housing projects have to offer low income people a right to return. And that's good, but it's a hard policy to actually track and enforce. So there's a lot more work to be done there. That's frankly, and some of these policies are much easier to calibrate locally than they are to design on a statewide level. So that's another challenge, right? It's like right sizing where the policy should sit. Does it make sense to have a state policy, or does it make sense to have a local policy that is really responsive to local conditions and local capacity? Because to Veronica's point, different jurisdictions have really different capacities. So we can dream up all the state laws that we want, but we have to also recognize that in a lot of jurisdictions, there's no staff capacity which is not a dig on people's intelligence, but there literally aren't people to keep track of all of it. But you could design a local policy that might be more manageable and trackable and things like that. So, I mean, yeah, I could talk endlessly about displacement, but it's an evolving area, and I'm happy that we've had some success baking in anti-displacement policies into a number of new laws, but there's a lot more we could be doing in that space to make sure that low-income people are stable, and that, you know, people who have just historically not had much of a voice and who have been kind of left alone in disinvested communities can actually have a role and an active voice in sort of making sure that as we invest, they can remain in their community, and the community remains something that they recognize and a place where they still want to be, and that delivers things that they think that they need.
Thank you, Anya. I mean, and so, I mean, I think that clearly, you know, if we're trying to think about the multiple benefits that could be brought by our housing investments, and, you know, trying to meet our climate goals, trying to improve equitable access to opportunity, it does become a question of not just the number of units that we're producing, but where those units are going and who they're serving. And, you know, one of the most recent big bills in the past year that, you know, brought up a lot of these sort of location questions for some of us that were working on it was AB 2011, that Marina's organization sponsored it along with Buffy Wicks, and I guess I'll just give it to you, Marina, to explain what 2011 was doing and what you're trying to achieve with it.
Sure. So, you know, we actually started kind of the effort that led to 2011 a few years back, and it was really about kind of permitting residential development on certain commercial sites to kind of hit at kind of where do we want, like, how do we make it easier to have more land that is accessible for residential development in areas that are infill and have already kind of have development around them, and that are likely along transit corridors, likely are more tied to low VMT versus out in the outskirts. And, you know, over time, I mean, these are really tough political battles. You know, when we first introduced a bill on this topic with Assemblymember Bloom, it was really focused more on affordable development in these on these commercial sites. We quickly kind of got pulled into a battle around, you know, around what should be the labor standards, what should be, you know, environmental standards, what should be the role of local control. And I think, you know, these are always the challenges when we're trying to do something, as Anya noted, that is at a statewide basis, because it's really hard to figure out what is something that can work in you know, you can never do something that's going to work in every community, but sort of how do we do something that's going to be most workable and help the most number of people and harm the fewest number of people in the process too, right? And when we're dealing with, and this happens at the local level too, is when you're trying to pass like legislation or ordinances that are going to really change kind of where we are building housing. There's a lot of different stakeholders that come in and that you are trying to balance. And so, like I said, you know, our big challenges early on was really with opposition from the building trades and from, you know, from labor kind of more generally. And 2011 kind of shifted some of the dynamic because we partnered with the state carpenters. And so we had support from, they were co-sponsors for this piece of legislation, and also brought along SEIU and CSEA as supporters, which changed some of the political dynamics to try to get legislation done that would kind of open up and streamline development on commercial sites. You know, we talked a little bit earlier about SB 35 streamlining. SB 35 was focused on sites that are currently in the general plan, zoned for residential. And so this was really to kind of expand the universe of projects that would get similar treatment in SB 35 projects.
Yeah, I mean, so from a PCL perspective, generally supporting the idea of better utilizing these underutilized commercial sites and seeing the potential for bringing a better mix of uses into these large areas that are, empty parking lots and dilapidated malls. But for us, it was a question of how do you best direct it? When any PCL's perspective on many of these, CEQA streamlining, really strong, housing incentives, we have the mind that if you're really going to give that strong of a CEQA exemption to a project, it's really got to meet the highest standards and be in really be the right thing in the right place. And for us, that, as Dov was talking about, is really about the low VMT areas and really making sure that these are the most location efficient houses from a climate perspective, but also, really providing equitable access to transportation options and opportunity. That was PCL's angle in approaching it. Anya, your clients had a different perspective, more around focusing on the high resource areas. Could you explain your perspective and approach to 2011 and CEQA streamlining housing incentive programs like that in general?
Sure. Although I feel like I'm talking a lot, and I'd love to also hear from Veronica and Jeff a little bit more. But I can just say on making projects by right, we're generally supportive of doing that if it's a well-designed policy in high resource communities. Where we get very concerned is applying by right policies in low income neighborhoods that are already very sensitive to gentrification and displacement, and where, as we've talked about before, low income communities of color have historically been locked out of decision-making processes. And by making something by right, you take away a key avenue that those communities actually have to participate in and have a voice in what happens in their own communities. And that is just sort of antithetical to housing justice principles. We want people who have historically been locked out of decision-making to have a voice in what happens in their communities. We also think CEQA is important from an environmental perspective and from a protecting people from harm perspective. And so I think there's a lot of questions about, is that really an appropriate approach in those communities? Or is there some other avenue to make it easier for developers not to have to go through a million hoops, right, to get a project approved, but also not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Also, we have to be careful about how we bring, as I've talked about before, bringing in rapid, large-scale investment in the form of market rate housing into low-income communities causes neighborhood level displacement. It can be very disruptive. It's not that you can't ever do that, and certainly our perspective is we should just block off low-income communities from market rate disinvestment. That's not the argument. It's really, how do you deliver that in a way that pairs it with, input from the community and appropriate strategies to protect people from displacement, right? So that was really the big concern for us on 2011. Less about the affordable side of it. I mean, we have some quibbles with the fact that the bill on all sides still allows small businesses to be actively displaced. We think that's inappropriate, and we're already hearing a lot of really sad stories of what's to come there. And I think that that's probably something we can work to address over time. But the really big beef was with the market rate section, where we felt like the affordability provisions were far too low for the profit that developers were going to be able to get as a result of the bill. And also that it just simply was antithetical to those principles that we have, that you really shouldn't by right in low-income, low-resource communities, because it's going to cause a whole lot lot of other problems, and it just wasn't calibrated right to make sure that we're moving forward productively in those communities. So, I mean, hopefully over time we can work to address some of those problems and challenges and build it into a better tool that doesn't cause harm, because it's always about, for us, not harming the communities we're trying to uplift as we try to address the overall housing crisis.
And I know, Matt, you know, you had touched on sort of the goal, you know, PCL's perspective of trying to focus the development in low VMT areas, and, you know, Anya represented also groups that were concerned about kind of targeting it outside of high resource areas. And I think one of the challenges we really struggle with, and policymakers struggle with, is the lack of like good mapping and data on a whole slew of these issues. And that was, you know, I think when we were navigating AB 2011, there were a lot of these concerns that we wanted to try to figure out how to thread that needle. Like, you know, we would love to target the bill to low VMT areas. And then, you know, the data, the mapping, sort of consistent mapping throughout the state on those, on that is challenging. Right. And then at the same time, what maps we do have often, where there is low VMT tends to be in a lot of lower income communities that are not on our current maps in like the high and highest resource areas, which tend to be more suburban, you know, peripheral communities. And so it really becomes challenging to figure out how do we overlay these at times competing policy priorities, but in a way that with the data that we have. And I know I'm going to kick it to Veronica, because I know, like, especially in rural communities, that's a real challenge.
Yeah, I get to give my anti-maps pitch now. So I think all of these are really important issues, you know, and CCRH has been engaged with our partners and intrigued by kind of the possibilities that open up from some of these streamlining bills, where we can say this is the kind of housing development we want to see, and we can get the carpenters on board, and we can bring environmental advocates on board, and we can think seriously about anti-displacement. But so far we haven't really come up with a streamlining approach that works in rural communities. And that's for a lot of reasons. Oftentimes we're thinking about communities where land availability is not the major obstacle. You need infrastructure availability, funding availability well before you can decide, okay, can this particular old mall become something? We also have difficulties with the labor pool. And so we support livable wage jobs, but the more we rely on union labor and different labor standards that can work in urban areas, it's more difficult to get that in rural communities. We also, have serious issues with a lot of the metrics that come up. We have members who've been working for years to get one particular site built out, and they'll see over the course of 3 years that'll have 3 different opportunity designations, whether kind of across the state. You'll see, again, like undevelopable land being marked as high resource. You'll see whole communities where there's just not good enough data to make any kind of assessment that can knock it out of eligibility for different programs. And there's also a political aspect to this. A lot of our developers have said that they have chosen to pursue a local entitlement process, even on sites that could be eligible for streamlining, just because they feel like that's going to maintain the best relationship with the local government and with the neighbors, because there's a resentment of this increasing amount of state law that's dictating land use decisions. And so even if they could be streamlining, they kind of have the respect for the relationship in mind.
Thanks for that, Veronica.
Oh.
I want to
Okay.
turn here to the audience questions too, but I want to give Dov opportunity to respond to this particular question of how effective these major CEQA streamlining by right ministerial SB 35 mechanisms have operated on the CEQA regional level.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe just first on 2011. I mean, I think it's not something that CEQA really super engaged with for a variety of reasons, but I still haven't seen like a definitive map of like where where 2011 applies. I think it's kind of an inherently challenging process to actually, get a sense of what areas we're talking about. But I know Urban Footprint did some work on this and looked at some of the commercial areas in at least previous iterations. And, I think generally speaking, the types of projects that you'd get through 2011 on the general sites that 2011 allows for them are good for implementing regional plans. They're largely going to improve VMT performance. I think, and one thing I would mention just on, restricting to low VMT and just, personal hobby horse on this, but like there's value in making places that are not currently low VMT slightly lower VMT. You can actually get a big climate benefit from taking a high VMT place and making it, like regional average, than as opposed to taking a very low VMT and reducing VMT slightly. You know what I mean? So I think I kind of sometimes have a reaction to just saying, well, things should only ever apply to places that in 2020 or whatever your base here is are 15% below regional average or whatever. And that said, though, I think like with 2011 and frankly with some of the other bills like SB 35, we really have not seen a whole lot of usage in our region, and I don't expect 2011 to see a whole lot of usage, mostly because the labor and affordability standards, those things cost money. For 100% affordable projects for sure, and we might see those, but for mixed income projects, the affordability and labor requirements do cost money, and I don't, the sort of benefits that you get through these bills are not for our region generally greater than the costs that those sort of requirements impose. So that's just fundamentally why we don't see a whole lot of usage in our region. But what I usually tell folks when it's really difficult, as Anya mentioned, right, to create these bills that like work everywhere, right? And just because it doesn't work in our region doesn't mean it's a bad bill. And we are inextricably linked with the Bay Area at this point, and anything that improves the Bay Area's housing crisis is a good thing for the Sacramento region. So yeah, I mean, I think generally supportive from a personal standpoint. CEQA didn't take a position or anything like that, but I don't think we'll see a whole lot of usage.
Well, there's so many questions I continue to have around this, and I thank you, Marina, and for bringing up the mapping. I mean, improving and getting more consistent VMT mapping across both existing and projected is something that PCL is very interested in, and I think there is, as you had highlighted, Veronica, a lot of room for improvement on the opportunity mapping side as well. But I do want to turn it to some audience questions. I believe you, the panelists, can see in the Q&A, see the questions that have come up as well as in the chat. But I'll just read it. It's a technical question, so bear with me, but I hope you can read along with me too. If a jurisdiction is a medium, high, or highest opportunity area, does AFFH permit it to regulate affordable units to an essentially segregated area of MFR housing? For example, a greenfield area at the edge of the city that is farther from schools, jobs, and amenities. This may be necessary for housing element site inventories in light of the lack of parcels large enough for MFR in developed areas. Also, for greenfield development, what is the geographic scope of an AFFH determination, i.e., how granular will the analysis be? A neighborhood consisting of some blocks, census block or tract, can a jurisdiction continue to plan greenfield communities with a separate segregated MFR neighborhoods and low density small parcel neighborhoods? Is anyone wanting to take those technical questions?
Well, I would defer to Anya. Probably knows this stuff better than anyone in the state, so she'll probably have a smarter answer than me. But I think that generally speaking, from what we've seen in our region, yes, you are able you know, if you have a variation of opportunity tracks across your city, and the highest opportunity tracks, which, by the way, this is very common in our region, where the highest opportunity tracks tend to be the more suburban, the more exurban parts of cities. Yes, you can direct all of your multifamily housing towards those areas. And, you know, I'm somewhat contradicting myself earlier in the sense that, like, yeah, it's good to like make, you know, high VMT places a little bit less lower VMT, but, you know, at the same time, we'd like to see some, you know, multifamily uses as well in sort of the core as well. So I do think that you do see some of that happening, where you see some of, you know, satisfying a lot of lower income units in greenfield areas that haven't quite developed yet, and sort of absolving responsibility to rezone in cores.
I'm just gonna start by saying that's a really complex question, and so it's going to be hard to probably give it a super satisfying answer. But and part of that is because sort of fair housing analysis is very situational, and so like what AFFH is going to look like in one community or one neighborhood is very different than what it might look like in another community, right? And so there might be a place where putting a bunch of multifamily on the edge of existing single family, that might be totally fine. And there might be other places where that is simply increasing segregation, which is antithetical to the entire concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So I mean, this is why it's, you know, it's going to take a really long time to fulfill the promise of AFFH, which I should mention was a phrase that was first coined in the Federal Fair Housing Act, but really only got any teeth when the Obama administration actually did a rulemaking around it. And then Trump got rid of that, which is why we did a state policy. And I should note that the Biden administration actually just yesterday released a revised federal AFFH policy for review, which is really exciting. But it is a really complicated concept, and sort of like it's understandable that everyone is struggling a little bit with like, what does it really mean to make my housing element affirmatively further fair housing, or all of our local ordinances? Like there's a lot wrapped up in that, and so it's really hard to tackle a question like this with a simple yes or no answer, because it really kind of depends on where we are in the state and what community we're in, and sort of what are a whole bunch of other dynamics about the demographics of that community and the demographics of the region. So it's just not that easy.
Well, and I have not a lot to add on this, but you know, one of the things I was trying to get at the very top of this panel was sort of how we have these somewhat like disparate policy goals that don't like it's really hard to figure out how they all fit together, because they've been done kind of, here we've done this, and here we've done that, and here we've done this other thing, and sometimes they don't quite connect in a logical way. And you know, just this question makes me think about too, of like with our affordable housing funding programs in the state, the programs themselves typically require to be competitive that the affordable development be close to certain amenities, and location efficiency is sort of built into the program too. And so if a local government is able to then sort of accomplish their AFFH goals by planning their higher density units in these sort of peripheral areas, it's going to be really hard to actually get 100% affordable development on those sites, because it is inconsistent with the other requirements of the programs. And so kind of how do we do better at having a more cohesive sort of plan and execution of all of these critical policy goals?
That's right on the money, Marina. I was going to say the same thing, that a lot of this is countervailed by the funding programs. And I think that's why it's important to kind of step back and remember that we also have a Hearts and Minds campaign. I know everybody on this team is really committed to some of the nitty gritty granularity of percentage of VMT and which counts as an amenity, and is it a quarter mile or a half mile to the nearest school. But if, you know, the folks who are implementing these policies aren't trying to act in good faith, there's not a degree of mapping technicality that we're going to be able to catch them up with. You know, we can't just move it all to a block group and say like, we've precisely said where you need to put this housing. It's not going to work out if we're not also bringing people along, so that we're making these decisions in good faith.
Yeah, thanks for that, Veronica. I mean, I'm still, as everyone is, getting my head around AFFH implementation and how you measure it. I mean, it's similar to what Anya was saying about, it really depends on the unique conditions of that neighborhood or that geography. I mean, is there particularly different handling of it in rural areas that's emerging, is distinct from how AFFH is being, determinations are being made in the urban areas?
No, I don't think so. And I think it comes back in a lot of cases to those capacity issues. There are fewer staff members trying to make these kinds of planning decisions. There are even fewer agencies involved, in a jurisdiction that has an active housing authority for a single city. They're going to be making AFFH decisions about their own placemaking, but in a lot of times we're talking about places where there isn't even a housing authority active in the area. So there's a whole layer of potential AFFH decision making that's kind of lost in that process. So I think rural communities are oftentimes really more playing catch up with a lot of these state law changes.
Well, one specific question amongst that, the broader multi-level question, that I wonder if you could maybe provide a more specific answer for what is the geographic scope of an AFFH determination? Is it at a neighborhood scale? Is it a census tract or block?
So again, I'm not going to give you a satisfactory answer because there isn't one. The AFFH obligation so every city and county in California and every division of the state itself, so the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Department of Transportation, the State Business and Consumer Services Agency, have an affirmative obligation and duty under the law to affirmatively further fair housing in all of their housing and community development activities and take no action that is contrary to that legal duty. So it plays out in a whole host of ways. It applies to funding programs, it applies to decisions on zoning ordinances, it applies to everything. So it's not just a simple analysis that applies on some defined geographic scale. Does that make sense? That's why it's so complicated, because it's a duty that applies to everything levels of government are doing in the housing and community development context. So it is a really complex thing, and it would be fascinating. I'm happy to help do that if folks are interested, to pull together a panel of some of the real experts in the state and in the country on AFFH, and we could really dig in with some richness if that's something that PCL is interested in us pulling together for you, because I get that it is complicated and it's really hard to talk about just in the context of this one webinar, when I think there's a lot of people who could provide you with better answers than I'm providing.
And I can give an example of that, maybe at just one aspect of that to kind of highlight what Anya is saying. So the main way that CEQA interacts with AFFH is through our RENA methodology, which is how we distribute our regional determination that we get from HCD to the different cities and counties. And then cities and counties have to then update their housing elements and do everything on the city level and the parcel level. But so for us, it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And how we chose to try to affirmatively further fair housing in our methodology is to essentially measure how much of our MTP SCS, our sort of climate focused land use strategy over the next 20 years, how much of that growth is happening in high opportunity areas based on the TCAC HCD maps. It's a very imperfect way to do it. That's just sort of what we had to go off of. And those TCAC HCD opportunity maps are census tract based. And because of the massive geographic scale differences between census tracts, you have situations where you have census tracts the size of the combined cities of Folsom, Elk Grove, and Rancho Cordova, right, in rural areas, and then you have Boulevard Park as a census tract, right? So it is a challenge to kind of use these maps. And what we ended up doing is we drew a threshold line because the TCAC ACD maps are really at their onset were intended to be about funding eligibility, right? And bonus points for affordable housing projects. They weren't designed to be, tools to sort of think about zoning. That's, I mean, maybe there's applications for that, but that was not their original intent from the Fair Housing Task Force, as I understand it. And so, does it really make sense to use RHNA as a mechanism to like open up zoning in these super rural tracts that are 3 times the size of Elk Grove? Maybe not. So what we did is we used a threshold of persons per square mile that basically said, for the purposes of this RHNA methodology, we're not going to call this tract high opportunity unless it's above a certain population density, because there's a reality around for fair housing purposes, and for zoning, you want to have people near services and transit and things like that. So that was sort of one tricky part of the TCAC maps that we had to sort of navigate as a part of the RHNA methodology.
So I mean, I guess what's kind of a simple way of putting it is, as far as the scope of AFFH determination isn't necessarily just a geographic scope or a physical boundary, but also depends on the scope of the policy or action that's being taken. Another question from the audience, I'll move on, from Elizabeth Patterson. What is the role for development community to participate in affordable housing, for instance, limiting the cost of land use driven by investors or flipping properties?
There's a lot of different directions I think we could go with sort of this question. For sort of traditional affordable housing developers that I represent, they sort of occupy a specific niche of kind of product type, and that is this sort of 3 to 5 story, 100 unit average kind of rental housing. And so sort of they're not competing with a lot of other developers, because typically you're looking at sort of either smaller scale sites on smaller scale developments, I think on smaller sites that might be market rate, or much larger market rate development. So I don't have a great answer for this one. I imagine it's probably a little bit going into sort of a community land trust space too, that maybe other people want to talk about.
Well, I will say, in jurisdictions that have inclusionary zoning policies, there are requirements and incentives in place for market rate developers to also be thinking about affordable housing in their new products. The CCRH developers probably do a little bit more single family home development and smaller multifamily than kind of Marina's core membership tend to do. So we have something that might be competing a little bit more with market rate developers, but often it's in communities where we're not seeing a lot of market rate development anyway. And so our members do a broader swath of products. But I think it does behoove, everyone who's trying to build housing to have at least some of the same core messages around communities need this housing. And if there's not market rate housing production happening in concert with affordable housing production, especially with the changes in commute patterns post-COVID, we're seeing communities where, whole swaths of the housing inventory are being bought up by folks who are now working from home. And that means that the people who lived there beforehand aren't just, having to settle for subpar apartments, but are actually in motels or moving 2 towns over and driving back to their service jobs in the better communities. So having to think about we have to think about the whole spectrum of housing production.
Thanks for that, Veronica. I have a couple of other, thanks for answering these acronym questions, folks, also. A couple of really interesting questions from David Keller here. I think you can read it in the chat. I won't read the whole thing, but the basic question is, will there be a redevelopment 2.0? I mean, since redevelopment was dissolved, there have been a number of new tax increment financing mechanisms that have been created, CREA's enhanced infrastructure finance districts, have started to be used here locally in Sacramento. So I'm wondering if we're seeing them used at a scale that's really filling that gap that was left by the wake of redevelopment, or if there really is a need for a stronger instrument like redevelopment to fill that gap.
I mean, I think the short answer is no. I think we've sort of moved on from conversations about redevelopment 2.0 in the capital. But of course, still having lots and lots of conversations about sort of what's at the core of that question, which is like, how do we create permanent, sustainable, ongoing funding sources for affordable housing and to the infrastructure point, right? These are real needs that even pre-redevelopment, we were not funding them at scale. And redevelopment was, gutting redevelopment created yet another layer of problems. And so, some places, like for example, for folks who are following this, in Los Angeles, they just passed Measure U at the ballot in November, which is a tax on the transfer of properties worth, I believe, over $5 million, all properties, residential, commercial, whatever. And that passed, and that's going to generate something like $800 million a year in the city of Los Angeles to fund the production, preservation of housing affordable to households at 80% of the area median income and below. So that's like the low, very low, extremely low, et cetera, income population, and also to provide funding for rental assistance and different forms of tenant protections. And so like that's in some localities, right, they're able to step up and sort of fill that gap with local measures. But not every jurisdiction is going to have that capacity or that political will. And so it still is, I think, a really important thing to focus on at the state level. I think we'll probably see funding measures coming out of the Bay Area where there's a lot of political will for that as well. And some places can really help themselves and fill the gap, but the state really still needs to wrestle with that. But it's probably not going to look like redevelopment did. Because I think that ship has really sailed, and I think we've moved on from tax increment being the way to go.
Yeah, and you referenced it, Matt. I mean, in the CEQA region, we haven't really seen the like redevelopment replacement mechanisms, at scale. I think West Sacramento was one of the first, I don't know, EIFDs in the state. And I think they, that's a success story, but that's kind of a unique situation because they have a pretty hefty slice of the tax pie, and it's not super repeatable. You've seen a few specific instances of them used in the city of Sacramento. I think, Aggie Square and the MLS stadium and the rail yards, I believe, maybe another one I'm forgetting, but really specific instances where there, as a part of the creation of the district, is a big sort of catalytic project involved that actually is going to stimulate somewhat dramatic increases in property values. So what you don't have is sort of places where you kind of want to catalyze the investment in the first place without sort of that project coming in. So I haven't really seen any of these things be used, and I'm not super optimistic that sort of the existing tools that we have for tax increment financing, in any meaningful way replace what redevelopment had, flaws as it did have. But I think there's still that need for, and I'm keep saying it, but there's still that need for some of what redevelopment provided, of course, on affordable housing dollars, but also just around housing related infrastructure.
Yeah, I would agree with everyone that sort of bringing back like a redevelopment 2.0 is highly unlikely. But I think what you bring up is a bigger question, which is sort of that there's an inherent flaw in the way we fund sort of housing related infrastructure, and the property tax system generally in the state, right? And so I think the challenge with all of these conversations is a lot of people will be like, let's have redevelopment 2.0, or let's reduce impact fees and have impact fee reforms, but nobody actually wants to get to like the real crux of the issue, which is we have a system that sort of fundamentally creates a barrier to entry for new development, new homeowners, for people who don't currently own property. And until we're willing to have those hard conversations and really kind of get to the root of that issue, I don't know how we really address a lot of sort of the challenges that we've even talked about around infrastructure and getting the housing that we need for the folks who can't currently afford to live in the state.
Veronica, do you have thoughts on this? Or I mean, I'd be interested to hear, are some of these tax increment financing mechanisms being utilized in rural areas, or do you not get that kind of property value differential enough to make it pencil out?
Yeah, it hasn't been a tool we've seen used in the communities we work in to any significant extent. You know, not a lot of soccer stadiums going up. And I think I think Marina's absolutely right. There's some bigger conversations we need to have, and those can get touchy in communities where you do have a lot more, on average, more homeowners and lower income homeowners. So the idea of kind of fiddling with how we assess property taxes is much more of a third rail.
Well, another interesting question from David, the second one was, you can see in the chat, what are the mechanisms under the RHNA for considering excluding housing in fire risk zones and climate change impact areas or flood zones, et cetera? How does that work into the RHNA allocation?
Well, and Dov probably has something to add to this, but the statutes that govern how COGS have to develop a RHNA allocation methodology to allocate a share of the RHNA to every jurisdiction in the region allow and frankly encourage regions to look at climate change impacts as part of that process, so that they're not allocating a ridiculously high RHNA number to a jurisdiction that has, is where a significant chunk of their developable land is also maybe going to get swallowed up by sea level rise, as an example. Like, so those are part of that process. And then for cities and counties, right, as they're thinking about how they're accommodating their RHNA and designing their housing elements, those things are also fair game, but they can't also be a hiding place for violating AFFH, right? And so that's one of the difficult balancing acts for local governments, is figuring out, where can we really not have housing sites because of climate change impacts, and where might people be using that as a hiding place for NIMBYism, right? And that's a tough thing to navigate at the local level, and it's also a tough thing for HCD to navigate as they're reviewing housing elements and deciding whether or not they meet all of the requirements of the law. But that is absolutely part of the conversation and baked into the law already.
I will say though, and not to beat up on those poor opportunity maps at every chance, but that's one of the things we noticed with the most recent data release, is that in a lot of the communities we work in, the high and highest resource areas identified by the opportunity maps were in high and very high fire zones as well. And so there's this tension of like, is that where we want to direct our investment? CCRH is never going to say we shouldn't build in any fire zones. There are still people living there. There are still folks who are going to be living there, whether or not we're building them affordable housing. And it can exclude communities who've done some really interesting thinking about sustainability, whether that means home hardening, reducing wildfire risk, or in the case of Paradise, finding from the depths of tragedy this opportunity to rethink their town's sustainability in a lot of the ways that we'd want any community to do. As they think about rebuilding, they're thinking about doing so with a lot of housing choice, with denser development patterns, with better like pedestrian infrastructure. And so we want to be able to honor that, even as we make sure that folks are protected from fires and other climate disasters.
Yeah, I mean, so bringing it, I guess, full circle to SB 375, there is an internal consistency requirement between a region's RHNA methodology and our sustainable communities strategy. So, we think quite a bit about climate resilience, adaptation, and of course, mitigation. as a part of that plan, and the forecast is really grounded in a lot of climate issues. So the way that we satisfy that internal consistency requirement in our region, which is, this is not universal across the state, but we essentially, the RHNA methodology, the proportion of growth that each jurisdiction gets as a part of our SCS is sort of how we determine the total number of units that each jurisdiction gets for RHNA purposes. And then we use some of these other RHNA objectives around fair housing, around, jobs, housing, fit and mismatch, around, income parity, things like that. We use those as adjustment factors to kind of dial up and down the number of affordable units, or like the proportion of each jurisdiction that's actually affordable. So, aside from that, we do kind of rely on the state as a part of the housing element process to kind of ensure that jurisdictions are, within their city, making sure that the sites are actually not constrained via some of these, climate issues around flood risk and fire risk and things like that.
Well, I think, David asked another question here that I think might be a good one to close it out on. I mean, what's your proposal? What are your proposals for increasing the ease of entry of disadvantaged and lower income communities into housing ownership? Is that, I guess the first part of that question is that the goal?
Well, I mean, I think, the way that we, for a variety of reasons, we have set up wealth creation to be very advantaged via home ownership in our society. I don't necessarily think that's maybe the best way we should do it, but that is sort of the system we've set up. So I do think it is a goal given the current setup. I'll just touch a very small niche thing that I think is an interesting, positive potential thing that could happen in the next few years. It's not solving this problem entirely, but SB 9, people, I think implementation has been sort of, rocky and few and far between so far. I think, this is likely something that is going to continue to be amended, and it'll, I believe, be something like ADU law that takes a few years to kind of really start ramping up. But I think there's tremendous.
SB 9 for the audience, please.
Yeah, SB 9 basically allows for ministerial lot splits of single family homes across the state, and you can get a duplex on each one of those lot splits. There's a lot of nuance around that I won't go into, but that's the provision that I'm most interested in, to get ministerial lot splits. And there's companies that are, it took a while to get the ecosystem going for ADUs. I think it'll be the same for SB 9. And there's interesting models happening now around companies that will essentially say, hey, this $1 million house, it's got a big backyard. As a part of purchasing it, why don't we subdivide it, and you essentially are selling off the backyard of this house, and as a part of purchase, this is now a $600,000 house, right? So I think it is opening, that's obviously still not affordable for lower income households, but it's an improvement, right? And you can see in maybe lower cost markets how you could actually get down single family homes could become more affordable for folks through something like that. You also see similar models around folks for staying in place, right? That would have had to sell, but maybe already are in their home and are moving to fixed income, maybe can't, continue to afford to stay there, would have had to move otherwise, but can then, subdivide and sell their backyard. And there's models now in Sacramento. Build Casa is one that just started up that will, give you up to $250,000 for your backyard, and then they build a duplex. So I think these types of models are really promising for getting, for increasing home ownership among lower income folks.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah,
Well,
a few
just-
things.
oh.
Go.
No, please go. I didn't see you on mute.
I think continuing to pay attention to the home ownership programs that have been working in the state. I think self-help housing has been a great asset. That's how a lot of lower income families in rural communities and in urban communities end up owning their homes. Thinking seriously about making sure there's access to good retail banking, and thinking about kind of the role that our banks have in affirmatively furthering fair housing and mortgage issuing and providing first-time homeowner counseling programs and credit repair programs. And then also keeping in mind in our discussion of sustainability and density that we have varying household compositions throughout the state. So we don't want to focus entirely on, thinking about one-bedroom products or infill definitions that assume it's a 1 or 2 person household. You may have a lower income family that's extended family, that's cousins and sisters and aunts and uncles, and thinking about home ownership opportunities and incentivizing types of housing that also fulfill those needs, because that can be some of the most dense housing we have.
Wholeheartedly agree with everything Veronica just said, and just 2 points to add to that. Number one, there is a lot of complexity around homeownership, and when low-income renters are paying 60, 70, 80% of their income in rent, it's impossible to even get on a path to homeownership. So creating more affordable rental housing opportunities actually is part of the path to homeownership. But also, I just want to punch up what Veronica said about there are a lot of really unique homeownership programs that work, and some that we're working and we may be losing. And I want to give the example of the city of Coachella, which is down in Riverside County. The city of Coachella is, I'm going to forget the exact numbers, but the average median income in Coachella is something like $40,000 a year, and it's a predominantly Latinx community. With those data, you would not expect that the city of Coachella has a 72% homeownership rate, but it does, and it's because the city made very smart use of some of these homeownership programs. And so that is something that we can build on and replicate in other communities in the state if we are going to continue to invest in homeownership programs. And so it's possible, but it is a complex topic we could probably do an entire whole panel on.
And I don't have much to add beyond what my fellow panelists have shared already, but one of the things, because again, we largely represent developers of deed restricted multifamily housing for low income households. I think what have always been interest to me is there are tenants in low income housing developments that are over income who came in at perhaps 50% of median income and have slowly but surely been working their way up the income spectrum. And we don't evict households as they work their way up, because we want them to continue, we want to keep them stably housed. And so if we could have programs that really target some of those households and help them move into home ownership, not only does that help a family that was low income have an ownership opportunity, they are also, as Anya noted, someone who has been benefiting from more affordable rents, so they probably have more savings that they could have built for that purpose, but it also will open up another unit to be able to be rented to a lower income household in need.
Well, with that, we are over time. I really appreciate the conversation. I don't think that we figured out all of California's housing solution. There's so much more to talk about, and we will continue to talk about these issues for years to come, I'm sure. I really thank you for your insights and taking the time today to join us.
Matt, I don't understand, with such great experience and knowledge on this panel, they haven't solved the housing problem yet in California. Yeah, this is great. This is a great conversation. I want to thank all you guys for participating and joining us today, as well as all the attendees. I often get asked a question. I actually got this as a private chat earlier, why we do housing, why PCL does housing policy. We are not a housing group. We are a land use group and have been for 55 plus years, but more recently in the last decade plus have gotten pulled into housing. And I answer very simply that for PCL, housing, where we build and what we build, is a climate issue. And we have the responsibility as all citizens of this nation to help house appropriately everybody. And so that link between the climate crisis and how do we help solutions and goals and priorities and policy with the climate and with housing our fellow neighbors is an important effort. So PCL has taken this on in the last 5 or 10 years as a high policy priority. That's why Matt spends probably a large chunk of his time at the Capitol on housing, along with all the other environmental issues we deal with that our assembly is talking about. I got a text from somebody saying, you stuck a housing conversation in the middle of your methane and your renewable energy panels. And I was like, yes, it's exactly one of the biggest topics we need to tackle as a society. So I really appreciate all four of you being here today. Thank you, Matt, for putting a great panel together and moderating this. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I want to give everyone a little update on our future schedule here. We'll be adding a new session. We kind of had to shuffle some sessions around on February 2nd because of two legislators and their floor schedule. Heaven forbid they wanted to skip out on their floor session so they could come to our panel first thing in the morning. We had to push that back. So we had an empty slot on February 2nd at 9 a.m. We're filling that with modular nuclear reactor conversation. So you're talking about a really extreme measure conversation that we need to start addressing to meet our climate needs. That's going to be a great panel. Later that afternoon, we're talking about offshore wind, which is something that I've gotten pulled into the last year or two because of all the interest on the West Coast now, and California just had their leasing agreements up this past year for two sites, two areas in California. So we're going to be holding a panel with some notable experts from across the country on offshore wind, as well as mitigation for our methane capture and mitigation, which is another one of our panels next week, the 26th at 9 a.m. So again, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time. Sorry for being over a few minutes. We look forward to seeing everyone next Thursday. Take care.